Bonjour tout le monde. All right. The rest is going to be in English because that's about the extent of my French. No, I know un petit peu. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to you about crafting compassionate code. And I'm very excited to be here. I came all the way from San Diego, which is a beautiful location. And I'm really excited. Maxime reached out to me a while back, and the whole organizing team has been really supportive, so I thank all of you. Let's give a round of applause for all the volunteers and everybody helping out, because seriously, putting on this kind of event takes a lot of effort, so thank you. And thank you all for being here this early in the morning, and I appreciate that. So I want to talk a little bit about my background so you know where I'm coming from. So I often talk about problems in tech, but I want to say for the record that I love tech. I've been coding for 17 years. I started off coding in high school. I studied computer science. I went on to work in the industry. I spent 10 years writing code and leading engineering teams in Silicon Valley at various companies. I spend a lot of time teaching coding and mentoring with volunteer groups. So, you know, I love tech. And yet, I've found that tech culture can sometimes be toxic. So what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, we have problems with stress and burnout in the industry. You know, I'm sure you may have experienced this yourself, and sometimes it can be more severe in Silicon Valley, but I still think that it's definitely a problem that goes beyond that, and I could tell that from all the traveling that I've done and talking with people in different locations. Lack of diversity is a problem. From my vantage point from up here, looks a little bit like this picture, just saying. And you know, that can be a serious problem, and we'll get into more about why. I think sometimes we've been building unethical products. I definitely saw this a lot. The question is, are the technologies that we're building improving people's lives, or perhaps not, maybe making us feel disconnected? So, you know, are we building addictive products? But more than that, how are we treating our users' data? You know, what are we doing? Are we using the dark patterns that were mentioned in yesterday's keynote? You know, these are things that need to be considered, and I think a lot of times we're not considering the ethics of what we're building. And then we see articles like this from last year. Programmers are having a huge debate over whether they should be required to behave respectfully to each other. And this is just seen as normal that, in the industry. And this was about an open source project that was trying to introduce a code of conduct, and there was some rebellion against that because, you know, heaven forbid that you have to be kind to each other. I wrote this article, Suffering on Stack Overflow, because I think that's one of the sites that has the most severe cases of toxic tech culture. And an example and why I wrote this article, I'm in this Facebook group for women in tech, and I saw this post. I'll read it out. I've really been struggling this week. I've been in tears for most of it, and now I just got a snarky response on Stack Overflow telling me how easy the solution is and that I need to learn how to debug my own code. I'm ready to throw the towel in. Now, if you read this and think, oh, what a weak person, you know, they just need to, you know, grow a thicker skin and, you know, dive into the challenge. That's not a very compassionate response, first of all. But like the danger here is that if this woman does throw in the towel because of the snarky response she got on Stack Overflow, imagine the talent that we're losing, because she's probably not the only one. She's definitely not, which you can read about in that article where I go into detail about all the people who've been many people who've been discouraged by Stack Overflow, by the communication style there, the snarkiness, the arrogance. So I came to this conclusion that there's a lot of suffering in and around the tech industry and the programming culture in general. So what's the root cause? Well, I'd like to propose one, which is that programmers don't like people. Now, this is a bold claim, right? Especially coming from me, a programmer. And I didn't come up with this statement here. It comes from a study from the 1960s that came out of IBM. And they hired a firm to figure out what makes for a successful software developer. And here's what they found. Programmers are crazy about puzzles, tend to like research applications and risk-taking, and don't like people. Now, this was the 1960s, and you'll notice, too, that all the people in the photo there are men, very much like that other photo I showed. This is the 1960s, so you may think, we've moved past that. Things are different now, right? Now this isn't true. The problem is that IBM was very influential, and so they affected a lot of the hiring practices that more modern companies use now. I think even like places like Google, a lot of the ways they still hire, and Microsoft, the ways they still hire are based on this very narrow profile of what an engineer is. It's somebody who matches this description, likes coding alone in a basement somewhere, doesn't like interacting with people. And this turns off people at every turn. It turns off young people, young people from going into coding because they think, well, I like people, so I don't want to be in a profession that's about not liking people. And then in the actual industry, we have so many people problems because of this. So I actually have a more generous interpretation of this, this not liking people. I don't think it's that programmers don't like people. Myself, I know that I find a lot of comfort in coding because there are clearly defined rules. You know whether or not you've gotten the right answer in most cases. And it's comfortable. It's much more comfortable than the messy human world that we live in, where there's blurry lines and things are fuzzy. And so I don't think it's that programmers don't like people. I think it's that sometimes we seek escapism in the code because things are neat and nice and clear. However, there are some people who actually don't like people. So here are some commit messages. They're kind of small, so I'll read them out. Clarification for stupid users. Added UI element for the stupid user. Being smarter for the stupid user. Do default value for stupid user. Add readme comment for idiot user in the classroom, etc. I think the funniest one is the last one. Be nicer for the stupid user, which is like a little contradiction there. So anyway, the point is that sometimes there's this arrogance that goes along with programming, where we think people who don't program are stupid. Programming is kind of on a pedestal. We think, in yesterday's talk about how developers are powerful, it's very true. However, the question is, should it be so true? There's so many roles that go into creating software that aren't just programming. And yet we continue to put programming on a pedestal, which leads to the arrogance, which leads to the condescending attitudes that are very common in the industry. There's also this sense that hard technical skills are more important than soft skills, a term that I don't even like because I don't think it's accurate to describe people skills. And is this even true? I mean, what we're building is for people. So is it true that hard skills are more important than soft skills? Also, let's look at why software projects fail. Are they failing for technical reasons? Usually not. So here's a study from the Application Developers Alliance that asked, why do software projects fail? And there's a lot of things here, and it's not important to read them all. But the top ones there are all human problems. Changing requirements, poor team management, developer churn, people leaving the company, all of these sorts of things. And the only purely technical one, if you could even call it that, is the last one, immature dev tools and application platforms. But a lot of our discourse in tech is about the hot new framework and this new tool, and we need to update this, and we need to do that. And that's not really why our projects are failing. And I would also argue that there is no purely technical reason. These are all human problems, because who decides what tools we use? Humans. Who uses the tools and implements them? Humans. So all of the problems in tech are actually human problems. And if you let this sink in, it's like, whoa, okay, so now we've been hiring all these people who kind of avoid people, and we have all these people problems. Something's got to change. So what can we do about this? Well, it's pretty easy. Just care more about people. It's easy and hard, so it's simple and difficult. So that's why I want to introduce this idea of compassion as a solution to improving the tech industry, improving the bottom line as well. As we saw, projects are failing because of these people reasons. So compassion, a lot of people have preconceptions about what it means, so I want to clarify. Compassion doesn't mean being fake nice or pretending that everything's okay when it's not. Compassion is not ignoring logic. This is a busted up Rubik's Cube, so that's supposed to represent kind of destroying logic. That's not what compassion is. And compassion is not sugarcoating, meaning that it's not just putting a nice cover on what you're trying to say or being political or anything like that. And these are things that people sometimes think about compassion, but that are not true. Compassion is also not the same as pity. So we can feel compassion for people without pitying them, because pity is a related concept, but often means feeling superior to somebody, so you're kind of looking down on them. So compassion is not the same as pity. So what is compassion? So I learned about compassion from going vegan in 2016, because being vegan is about having compassion for all life. It's this idea that you don't want to contribute to suffering of animals or humans. So far, it's been a little bit tricky in Paris to eat vegan, but I did find that Domino's has vegan pizza here, which was pretty cool. So compassion, and this comes from UC Berkeley, and I feel like it's a very rational definition of compassion. Compassion is the feeling that arises when you are confronted with another's suffering and feel motivated to relieve that suffering. So it's not this touchy-feely, intangible thing. It's this very logical thing. You observe suffering, you notice the suffering, and then you want to do something about it. Another way to look at it is that compassion is empathy plus action. So we often talk about empathy in tech, but compassion takes it a step further, meaning that you feel what others are feeling, empathy, but you also want to take steps to help them feel better. So you want to take action. So I started my company, Compassionate Coding, inspired by this concept of compassion in 2016. And to clarify what it is, it's a new approach to software development that seeks to minimize suffering for technologists, users, and the global community by applying emotional intelligence and ethics. And as I mentioned, this is good for the bottom line. It's not just a nice, fluffy thing to do. This comes from a book called Awakening Compassion at Work, which I highly recommend. Compassionate business units exhibited better financial performance, and these units realized higher employee and customer retention, which makes sense if you think about it. If you treat people better, whether they're customers or employees, they're more likely to stick around. So compassion is good for the bottom line. So for the rest of the talk, I want to talk about how compassion impacts our actual code, because I know that that's what developers tend to really care about, is the actual code. People always ask me, do you still code, April? As if that determines whether or not my opinion still matters. For the record, I do, but it shouldn't matter, because just the fact that I have coded, the fact that I know about coding, my opinion, matters in the same way that anyone else's opinion matters, whether or not they've ever coded. Anyway, that said, we're starting from where we are. So I want to talk about how compassion affects how we code, what we code, and why we code. So 1, how compassion affects how we code. So here's some code. And if you were given enough time, you can probably figure out what it does. And maybe if you've been interviewing a lot at tech companies, you just know by looking at it because you've had to write similar code. But it will take some time. You'll have to work through it a little bit to figure out what this code is trying to do, maybe work through some examples. And part of the reason for that is the variable names are not very descriptive. They're single letter variable names. You don't know what they're doing. There's not comments. Not that that would be an ideal solution, but it's not the best code in terms of compassion. Because imagine somebody trying to read this code. There's going to be some level of suffering trying to understand it. So here's the same code with only variable names changed. And you'll see it's bubble sort. And it's a lot easier to understand. And maybe these aren't the best variable names, but they're a little bit better. We've taken an improvement. And I would say the difference between these two is compassion. It's this idea that we've thought about other people who are going to be reading our code and then updated the code to make it easier for them to understand. So we're trying to minimize the suffering of people reading this code in the future. And as you may have heard, code is read many more times than it's written, right? And so even you are probably going to read this code in the future. And so if you can make it easier to understand, you're going to reduce suffering for yourself as well. So good variable naming requires compassion. The same thing is true for refactoring, API design, tool selection, architecture design. What you're doing is figuring out how to minimize suffering for all the people who are going to read your code and who are going to be affected by your code, maintaining your code, using your APIs. So compassion provides a lens for all of these things. So you may think, well, these are just best practices. We want to make variable names that are longer and descriptive. These are just best practices. Some white guy who wrote a book about coding said we should do it, so we should do it. It's clean code. But I would say that more important than thinking about best practices and what some programming hero says, one of your programming heroes says about code, think about minimizing suffering, making the code less painful for future people. And so if you put people at the center, then you don't need to read some book written by one of your programming heroes. You can think about how to reduce suffering by thinking about the stakeholders, thinking about your coworkers, et cetera. So that's one way it affects how we code. Another way it affects how we code. So coding can be frustrating. I don't know about you, but sometimes I get really frustrated when I'm coding, as much as I do love it. And sometimes the things that go through my head when I'm frustrated are not the nicest things. I may think, I'm such an idiot. Why can't I get this? It's all my fault if, the production goes down because I checked in, a bug or something. I'm a horrible person. Sometimes it gets really bad, especially if I feel I've made a big mistake. Now, these are not very nice ways of talking to yourself in your head. And yet a lot of us have this inner critic going all the time, criticizing everything we do. Now, it's not to say that we shouldn't acknowledge our mistakes, but this is not very productive. This is not a very productive way to talk to yourself, and it's definitely not very compassionate. The problem is sometimes we treat ourselves like the machines that we're working on. So we expect ourselves to produce perfect, high-quality output constantly, and sometimes we don't take time to rest or take care of our human needs. And the truth is that we are not robots. We are not machines. We are, in fact, human beings with emotions. And we need to take care of those emotions as we talk to ourselves and make sure that we're taking time for rest so that we avoid the burnout and stress that I mentioned. We can't completely avoid stress, of course, but we can manage it and how it affects us. So there's this idea of self-compassion, and you can read more about it in the work of psychologist Kristen Neff, but it's this idea that we talk to ourselves as we would a good friend. So instead of calling yourself an idiot, if your friend broke production, like a good friend, you probably wouldn't say, "You're such an idiot, you broke production. You should feel ashamed of yourself." I don't think we need to feel ashamed or guilty. I think we just need to look at what we've done and decide how we're going to get better, but without beating ourselves up. And self-compassion is the key to this idea that we should be kind to ourselves. And this is a little bit foreign to how we've been taught to act towards ourselves, because we've been taught to be very efficient and very tough on ourselves and keep cranking out good code all the time, and there's a lot of pressure. But this is why we say things like imposter syndrome. Like who's ever felt imposter syndrome? See, okay, so people do raise hands at conferences sometimes. I've definitely felt imposter syndrome a lot. And, I think some people, too, feel it, but it doesn't express as insecurity outwardly. It expresses itself as arrogance. And I've done this as well, where because I feel so insecure, I have to act super arrogant and like I'm smarter than everyone else in the room because I feel so insecure inside. And people don't talk about that a lot because it's embarrassing, and sometimes we're not even aware we're doing it. But it all comes from this harshness towards ourselves and towards others in tech. So another way it affects how we code is affecting our collaboration and mentoring techniques. So I think that, a lot of the ways we've been trained to code is just solo coding. In our interviews, in our tech interviews, we're given assignments and told to code on our own. And so we don't typically evaluate in interviews how people are at teaching concepts. And teaching requires empathy. And a lot of times, developers haven't been taught how to incorporate empathy and compassion into their work, how to collaborate effectively with people from different groups, how to mentor. And so if we bring compassion into it, it can affect how we collaborate and mentor, which is definitely part of our job. So I wrote this article, "It's Time to Retire RTFM," because I think these things we have, like these terms we have, like RTFM, are the opposite of compassion and show just how severe the problem is in tech, that we think it's fine when someone comes to us with some level of suffering because they're trying to figure something out, especially if they're a new person, and then we just say RTFM. It stands for read the flipping manual, something like that. I don't know. And I think that it's really not compassionate. So I wrote this very long article about it, and I had to write a long article because I knew that people would resist it, and so I tried to anticipate and address each of the areas that they might resist. So it's a very long article. So if you think, no, we need RTFM, I would suggest reading the article first, read the flipping article, and then we can have a discussion. Okay, so it affects how we code in these various ways. So instead of RTFM, we might actually try to help people and be a little bit more compassionate in how we mentor. It also affects what we code. So let's talk about feature prioritization. So, a lot of times we're in conversation with the product owner or somebody, or our manager, somebody else, and we're talking about which feature to build, or just our people on our team, which feature to build. Now, if we incorporate compassion, then we're going to let that guide what we work on, which means that we're not just going to work on whatever fun thing we want to do, or introduce this new JavaScript framework that we learned about that we've just been wanting to use, or switch everything to functional programming just because we want to work with that, but instead thinking about how to alleviate suffering in your users or create delight, the positive side there. So can you empathize with business people and product managers? Or do you dismiss them as non-technical? So I know how developers talk behind closed doors, and we do not have the most respectful things sometimes to say about people who are not coders, despite the fact that they're very important to the success of our products and ultimately our businesses. I really don't like this term non-technical because I think it's often used to make people feel lesser than. Like, your opinion, well, that's a nice idea, but you're non-technical, so you don't really get this. Or people will say when they're trying to, when they interview someone, I don't know, she just didn't seem technical enough, which is usually just a way of saying that my biases and my pattern matching of what a software engineer looks like doesn't match up with this person. So I think non-technical is a biased term. I think we should eliminate it as well. I've also written about this. You can read more. And I'll definitely put these slides up later, so don't feel pressure to write down these long URLs. It would not be compassionate for me to ask you to do that, so I'll put it up online. So here's the article about that. If you can use a fork, you're technical, which I think is true. So I talk about how even people who are working with spreadsheets can be technical. People who do basic arithmetic in their job can be technical, and so we dismiss them when we call them non-technical. And they don't like it, and it's not a very compassionate thing to do. So can you empathize with your coworkers who don't write code? And can you empathize with your users? Or do you call them stupid, like those commit messages that I showed before? And this, too, is common in tech. I will say that, in a lot of circles, this idea, or even if we don't say it out loud, sometimes we think it. And I think the best way to counteract this is to do user tests. So here's an article I read about that. User tests will make you a better developer. And I will say that when I sat in on my first user test, it was mind-blowing, because I sat there watching someone use the app I was working on, and I saw where they were confused. I saw what trouble they were having. And then it didn't matter what framework we had used so much, or how I had written some specific part of code. I had a new thing to be motivated about, which was how to alleviate suffering or create joy in that user. And so I highly encourage all of you, if you get the chance, to sit in on a user test. Even if you don't actually ask questions of the user, just to sit there and to see what they're doing and try to understand what's going through their head. Because that can be really motivating too, because you realize that your work is actually having an impact on people. It's not just fun code for you, but there's actually a bigger meaning there. So another thing to think about is your work causing suffering? Now, this can range from just a confusing user interface, a site that's not accessible to people with disabilities, or something more severe. So are you working on facial recognition that's going to be put in drones to decide who to kill, right? Some of us may be doing this, even if we are just working on some open source project, some graphics open source project, but then somehow that's going to be used by the military, right? Or if our actual company is doing it. So you may have read these articles about people at Google protesting because Google had a contract with the Pentagon in the United States for using technologies in wartime that Google was working on. And enough people protested that Google ended that contract with the Pentagon. So, referring back to that talk yesterday about the power we have as developers, we can speak up when we see that our work may be causing suffering. And so it's important to know what your own ethics are, to know if what you're working on is causing suffering in the world, and if that's really what you want to be working on. Sometimes we can have their unintentional consequences, unintentional suffering of the work we do. So here's a list. It's a little bit dated now, so some of these are gone, but of hate groups with large Twitter followings. So Twitter apparently did not anticipate all the horrible things that they would create in the world. And I think Twitter also does a lot of good. I think it amplifies voices of marginalized groups, and it helps people sometimes in disaster situations. And there's a lot of good that Twitter does, but also a lot of bad things happen on Twitter. And this doesn't just affect people who are on Twitter and who engage in the flame wars there, but even people offline, because these hate groups sometimes coordinate real-life violence using Twitter. In the United States, there was a rally that was largely coordinated through Twitter, and somebody died. So, if you let that sink in, that's pretty severe. So this website that was originally just designed to be like, hey, what's up? What's going on? Here's my breakfast, is now being used to coordinate killing people in real life. It's terrifying. Not to mention all the harassment that goes on. And let me tell you, as a woman online who now has significant Twitter following, I get a lot of that too. And so it runs the gamut there of severity in terms of the negativity there. So the question for you is, are you anticipating these things? Are you thinking about the suffering that your product might cause? Because that's part of compassion as well. Because you'll see with Twitter, now they're trying to catch up and trying to, patch these holes, but it's like whack-a-mole because now they've built in so much that is allowing negativity to happen on there. It's difficult to fix at this point given how large the site is now. Another thing to consider in terms of what we're building is, do you have the diverse perspectives on your team to help you anticipate some of these challenges? There was a facial recognition program that was not detecting as accurately with people with darker skin. And it was partly because they didn't have people on the team with darker skin. And so nobody even thought to check that. Perhaps more obvious example is, we have these automated soap dispensers where you put your hand under and the soap comes out. And many of those don't detect darker skin because they weren't tested with people with darker skin because there was no one on the team with darker skin. And so you see that we can have real problems when we don't have diverse perspectives on teams. And so part of your responsibility is not just to avoid being sexist or racist, in terms of what you say directly on a daily basis, but to go further than that and think how you can bring in more diverse voices onto your team so that you can build better products, but also more socially responsible products as well. Okay, so it affects how we code and what we code, but I think the highest level here to get to is allowing compassion to inform why we code. So why do you code? Have you thought about this? Probably you've maybe had to answer a similar question in an interview, and my guess is you answered something like this. I want to solve interesting problems. I like a challenge, something like this. Something, I hear that constantly, which is fine. However, it is fun to solve puzzles. It's fun to solve problems. That's one thing I enjoy about coding for sure. But can you go deeper than that? Is it enough? Because, you can solve problems that create products that do very horrible things in the world, as I mentioned. But on the other hand, you can also solve interesting problems and do good in the world. There's that quote, and I forget who said it, about how, the best minds of my generation are used to implement ads or create ads. And, that was by some developer. And it's an interesting thing to think about. Not that, ads are the most evil thing in the world, but sometimes they do damage for sure. And the question is, are they actually improving people's lives in most cases? And that's something to think about. So can you go deeper and think about your real why? Why do you code? And how can you use it to do good things in the world? My stance on this is that the only reason for technology to exist is to improve people's lives. So I think if it's not improving people's lives, why are we doing it? And it's important, too, to be inclusive in this, to think about which lives we're improving. Are we only making it easier for people in cushy situations to get a cab faster or to find a date faster? Or are we doing more than that? Are we really trying to have a deep impact on people's lives? And that's the ultimate goal here. So is your work improving people's lives? Think about what you're working on now, whether it's your side project, open source project, your day-to-day job. Is your work improving people's lives? Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be working for a nonprofit or working on it with a charity organization. You can improve people's lives in for-profit companies. My company is a for-profit company, and from the feedback I've gotten, in some ways I'm improving people's lives. I can sleep better at night now than when I was working on social games that were meant to be addictive and to get people to waste their money and keep them from interacting with real humans. I had trouble with that. And I had trouble at other companies that were using users' data in manipulative ways, or putting spammy pop-ups everywhere. That was hard to, that was difficult to deal with. It was difficult to feel like I was doing good in the world. And if your work is not improving people's lives, why not? You're not stuck where you are. You can always make a change. And if you're not using your work to improve people's lives, you can if you want to. Now, to do this, here are some examples to inspire you. So these are two examples of projects that people did. The first one is called Concern, and it works, the technology-wise, it's similar to Uber, that is location-based, and you can, you're in a location and then something comes to you. But instead of having food delivered or a cab delivered, it's a compassionate responder. So this was designed to be used in a neighborhood in San Francisco where there are a lot of homeless people who are on drugs and are often suffering in the streets. And what people usually do is call 911, and then the cops come, and it's usually a violent interaction. It's not very compassionate at all. Person may go to jail or something, but it's not a very positive social interaction. Concern instead of calling 911, what it will do is send you a compassionate responder to help that person and actually try to make a positive difference in their life. But it uses the same technology behind other location services, delivery services. So it's interesting. Now the second one is called Safe Night, and it's an app that lets you donate money in order for somebody who is escaping from a domestic abuse situation to find a hotel room for the night. Because the problem is that sometimes the shelters for domestic abuse survivors get filled up, and then they have nowhere to go. And so sometimes they go back to the bad situation they were in. So this was designed by an organization called Caravan Studios, which also is connected to a for-profit business, but they're a nonprofit. And they use their time and their resources and design thinking skills to come up with this app to make a real positive difference. And so you have the coding skills to do things like this. You could do this if you want, rather than building another dating app, So in order to find your own inspiration and what you really care about, the first step is to slow down. And the reason this is important is a lot of times we're moving so fast in our work that we don't take the time and the breath to think about what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. We allow our momentum and inertia to keep us going, and so we don't reflect on what we're actually doing day-to-day. So the first step is to slow down. Then you identify your core values. And what I mean by that is, why do you get up in the morning? Why do you code? What impact do you want to leave on the world? And the person here is writing because I think that actually taking the time to write with your hand can be really powerful versus the typing that we do all the time, because it forces you to do that slow down piece. So think about what you really care about, not what your company's values are that they have a poster on the wall about, all of that. If that's meaningful to you, incorporate that, but what you really care about on an individual basis. And then ask yourself on a regular basis. I try to ask myself every week, am I living and working according to my own core values? When I was working in that social gaming company, I was not. Part of when I went vegan, it was this realization that I valued peace and treating animals well. I always said I love animals, but then I was paying people to hurt them. So I realized that my actions were not aligned with my values. And so I made a change to my actions. And so, this affects our personal lives, our professional lives, but it's just important, even just asking the question is progress, because we don't often ask this question, and I think it can be very powerful, because the world is just made up of individuals, and if we all ask this, we can make a lot of positive change. So hopefully I've shown how compassion affects how we code, what we code, and why we code. So we often ask ourselves in tech, what's the efficient choice here? What's the lean choice? That one's especially popular in Silicon Valley. What's the agile choice? I'm proposing that we add an extra question here, which is what's the compassionate choice? Who's affected by this decision that I'm trying to make, whether it's what to work on, whether it's how to name this variable, whether it's what to say, what feedback to give in this code review, how to answer this Stack Overflow question. What's the compassionate choice? So here's a great quote from Karen Armstrong. If it is not tempered by compassion and empathy, reason can lead men and women into a moral void. And I think that this is what we have happening in tech right now, because a lot of very logical, intelligent people have been building our technology, but we've been kind of closing off our minds and eyes and hearts to the suffering that we may be contributing to and to the suffering happening in the world, which is why we have this moral void situation, which is not ideal. But you all can be part of the change to make things better. And I want to leave you with this. Compassion is not a soft skill. I don't like this term because I think it's used to dismiss these very important skills. Compassion is a catalytic skill, meaning that compassion catalyzes everything else that we do, all of our efforts, because it gives us motivation, it teaches us to care about something, and it helps us apply our technical skills in the most meaningful way. So I invite you to plant seeds of compassion in your code base, in your community, because even just a small kind word can go far, especially if it's somebody who's beginning in coding, but even to your coworkers and anyone else. And sometimes it feels like these are such big problems in the world, and how are we going to address them all? But we can start small by planting these seeds. That's what I feel I try to do with my company is, I may not have changed all your minds, but maybe I planted some seeds that will eventually grow, and then who knows what effect you'll have in your communities. So with that, thank you very much. And we have a little bit of time for questions, so.
So thank you for this presentation. Perhaps can we add that compassion is a way to be empathic, but not to burn out, because when we are too much empathic, it leads to too much suffering for ourselves, and we cannot help others. So this empathy is a waste of energy.
Yes, that's a really good question. So the question is basically, how do we balance being compassionate towards others with taking care of ourselves? Because it can be very draining and take a lot of our energy to be compassionate. Does that cover it pretty well, the question? Yeah. Okay, so that's a very good point. And that's why I mentioned self-compassion as well, because I think that if we're not taking care of ourselves, we can't take care of other people, we can't help anyone. So setting boundaries is very important for self-care. And so I think it's important to be compassionate, to care about people, but there's also something called compassion fatigue to look out for. And that means, being tired out because you've been caring so much. And a lot of people who work in nonprofits, I know a lot of vegans feel this because, they see animal suffering everywhere and they go through this. I deal with compassion fatigue because, I instead of just hiding in code, I've changed and now I actually pay attention to the suffering, and it's hard because there's suffering everywhere. And so I feel exhausted sometimes. And so what I've done is give myself permission to take care of myself in order to deal with others. So, people talk about on the airplane that you should put your own air mask on first before helping others. And it's a similar thing here. Take care of yourself. And, if you can't deal with something emotionally in the moment, step back and ask for space and deal with it later. Because there's no use in trying to be compassionate if you're so worn out that you're not taking good care of yourself. So I think it's a good point to make that compassion fatigue is real, and you want to definitely take time for self-care. Any other questions?
First, thank you for this great talk.
Thank you.
In one of your slides, you mentioned legibility of code as an act of compassion for maybe future suffering.
Yes.
Do you have other code design aspect to that matter, like architecture or other design aspects?
Yeah, so I think, when we talk about maintainability of code, for example, and how we can build code so that it can be easily modified in the future, a lot of times that discussion is based on best practices, as I mentioned. It's like, you should design the function this way, you should create the module this way. But that's something where instead we can think about, okay, if I were going to modify this in the future, what would make it easier to, do that? And so I think it doesn't even necessarily always change what decision we make. It more changes the conversation around it, so that instead of just comparing notes from different people's point of view about what's the best way to do this, we think instead, okay, let me put myself in the shoes of somebody who's going to be maintaining this code. What are they going to need to know, and how are they going to be able to do that? So even if you look at something like the DRY principle, don't repeat yourself, and of course there are exceptions to that. But if you think about that, that's because if you repeat code in a bunch of different places, somebody who wants to modify it is going to have to hunt down all those places and change the code in all those places. And so even that, you can think that's not a very compassionate thing to put on somebody in the future. So, it really, it affects even that. Even in terms of the programming language you choose to use, it may also affect that decision. Elm, for example, I think that has really nice error messages that are really like human readable and very compassionate error messages. And so you might choose to use a programming language based on how compassionate it is. A lot of people choose Ruby because it's user-friendly in a lot of ways. And user-friendly is another way of saying compassionate, really, ultimately. So those are a few more examples. I think there's some over there.
Hi, thanks. I really enjoyed your talk, especially because I'm a technology ethicist, so anytime people talk about ethics gets me excited. But I'm a little curious if you could develop a little further. Because the idea of compassion that you described sounds very individualistic. And there have been books recently written, sorry, I'm a philosopher, things like Against Empathy, about the...
I'm familiar with that, yeah.
Right, so the danger that this really drives you to think that you're being empathetic when you're not, because you're just projecting your own feelings onto others. So there's sort of, when you talk about like minimizing suffering, for example, there's the idea that I can actually identify suffering.
Yeah.
Which then leads to sort of this vicious circle where how am I going to know if what I'm creating is causing suffering until I've created it? And then you say, okay, well, then we have to integrate the users into the creation process.
Yeah.
But then that creates the sort of problem of, well, then how do they understand what we're creating? Well, then I have to teach them about how we're doing it. But then when I'm teaching them how they're doing it, they're going to become more like me and less like them. And then it's not the user anymore. They're like other programmers. Yeah. So I guess I'm curious about how you, is there a way to understand what you're doing in a way that doesn't just depend on that I have the right values, the right level of identification, the right kind of projection? Is there any way to not just hope that you're a good enough person to be able to do this successfully?
Yeah, so it's actually interesting you mentioned that book, Against Empathy, because a big part of that book is the idea that there's different types of empathy. And so this very sort of like emotional empathy is one type, but there's also a more logical version of empathy that actually is more like compassion, which is what the author talks about. And so the compassion that I presented here is much more rational. You actually think about how you're creating suffering in a very logical way. So to your point about how do we see how it's going to affect users, that's what all of the field of UX is all about, UX research, which is why I encourage participating in user testing. And again, we like to, because we're developers, we like to think in black and white terms, and it's like right, wrong, you know? But this is not that at all. So it's not, I have the only right solution, this is the right way. It's more, we're working on teams and we're all bringing our own values. And so it provides a framework for discussing that in the teams that we're on. And so it involves like perhaps difficult conversations about, you know, like for example, the drone example. If you, let's say that you're in a war with an entity that's going to be causing a lot more suffering, then yes, there will be a philosophical discussion, whether it's in your head or with the people that you're working with about, you know, are we going to cause more suffering or less suffering? And there's no perfect solution. There never is. But the point is that we haven't been having these discussions at all in much of tech. We've been shying away from them because they don't fit into our little neat boxes, our little black-white thinking. And so my invitation is to actually think about these things and to actually observe the suffering when you see it, do something about it, and see it as a constant experiment. And yes, there will be some mistakes along the way. And that's why also I'm a big fan of the growth mindset, which is that we're all trying to do our best, and when we learn how to do better, then we do better. And so it's a constantly evolving process. So yeah, there's no perfect solution there, but trying is better than not trying, and many of us have not been trying at all. Any other questions? Any women have a question? There we go. There's a phenomenon where if the first person asks a question is a man, it's much less likely for any women to ask a question. So I should have said that, but here we go.
Thank you. I really liked your talk, and my question is about you said that most software problems are people problems, which
Yes.
I agree completely on, and about the importance of soft skills, the so-called soft skills, and I agree that it's not a good term. How would you call them? Because we need to discuss about this and we need to
Yes.
improve this. And how can we talk about them?
Yes, so I prefer this skill that I used for compassion, which is for this term, catalytic skills. And the reason I use that term, and I first heard it from Daniel Goleman, who's an emotional intelligence researcher and author, but he mentioned it offhand in a talk at Google, and I thought that's a really good term, and it sounds very engineering-like, so engineers will resonate, I think, with it. But catalytic skills, the idea here is that being able to communicate your ideas, being able even to motivate yourself, which is part of emotional intelligence, helps you catalyze all your technical skills, meaning it helps you apply them in better ways and more efficient ways and more effective ways. And so I prefer this term catalytic skills. Another option you might consider is meta skills, because they're kind of the skills behind the skills in a lot of ways. So in terms of, like I said, motivation, like grit, the reason that you are able to persist in learning a programming language is because you have that persistence and grit. And so it's sort of a meta skill for that. But I've found that catalytic skills really resonates, especially in the tech industry, and so that's why I've been pushing this one. And it seems to be resonating. People are starting to put it on their resumes. They've been telling me about it, and it opens up conversations and job interviews. Whereas people skills or soft skills, it's just like, okay, yeah, everybody has that. But really, everybody doesn't have those. So that's the term I propose. I think we're good. Thank you very much.